one thing we didn't actually hit on yet is the specifics of your rotation and what you do as far as your timing and how you're planting. So let's focus on what you guys, your typical growing season looks like and your rotations from year to year. What you're putting down for your mixes and all of that.
After all the grain, we put down winter rye, hairy vetch, and field peas. And the interseeder, we put down oats, radishes, and
Some soybeans.
soybeans. Soybeans, there you go. Yeah.
And when did you put that down?
We put the legumes down. Last year we put the oats this year because when we move over 11 inches and planted our cover crop into our corn, this spring we came along and that darned old rye was coming back. We planted annual rye last year and not winter rye. Well, it came back, and that's the exact furrow that we're going to plant our soybeans into. So
I'm pretty sure that was perennial ryegrass they sold us last year.
well, yeah.
I know it was because
There's a lot of hybridization.
It says annual on the tag, and we wanted specifically annual, which is out.
VNS.
Yeah, I don't have any of the tags, but anyway, that's why we went with the oats this year, which isn't going to be as good. We'll definitely.
That's why we changed seed companies.
Don't have to do that.
So that's another thing that came up on one of these other webinars is the importance of making sure you've got the right seed.
Yeah. Knowing what your seed is and
How it will perform for variety. VNS doesn't save you money sometimes.
Yep.
well, the thing especially when you get into ryegrasses and the VNS is, so typically what that is, so you got all these different varieties of ryegrass. And at the end of the year, you could have several that mixed together and VNS and sell it retest it, sell it the next year, So you could have a wide variety of different traits in those within that one bag of seed. So it's sometimes it works just fine, and sometimes it might not be what you want.
were you able to terminate that ryegrass though?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that wasn't our intention. The field was perfectly clean, other than that ryegrass. That was a roundup trip that we wouldn't have had to make. The cows had everything else grazed just perfectly clean. There was no weeds coming up other than that. So I thought, geez, we shouldn't have to be chasing the sprayer around for some seed we didn't want. So that's a learning curve. Also, is the seed you buy, is it what you exactly want? And as the salesman, we've been through this before, where the salesman sold the seed he had, not what we were looking for. Just especially in the times of all the PP around the country, you're getting what they got, not what you want. So we've had to be a little more, had to get educated on that.
So tell us what you grew last year, when you harvested, what you ended up with your harvest, and then what you did post-harvest.
Yeah, we had wheat, soybeans, corn last year. Combined the wheat in a little bit later last year, later August, and
Middle of August, I suppose.
yeah, seeded rye, hairy vetch, and field peas, and terminated that this spring at about knee high, and planted soybeans into all that ground.
How'd you terminate?
Glyphosate, Roundup. Yeah, yeah.
And did interseeding last year with the machine that we built. And again, we did that this year too.
Just built that last year. We wanted to interseed some corn, made some calls. There were some guys that had an interseeder, this and that. They were pretty busy, kind of expensive, and we wanted a no-till one. We didn't want one that spread on top of the ground or a double disc. For no-tilling, then we figured the interseeder should be no-till. We shouldn't, the interseeder shouldn't be less than what your original planter is. So it ended up to be a lot heavier than what we wanted to do. We just happened to have a neighbor that had the no-till coulters that he took off every other one on his planter to plant 15-inch beans. So that was the access to that and the Valmar box. And anyway, we spent a few days in front of the garage, and it went together pretty quick, and it calibrated nice, and that's where we started with that. There we did the rye, the soybeans, and field pea. No, not in the interseeding. Radishes. There you go. Radishes, soybeans, and rye.
How'd that turn out in the fall?
You know, it was a weird kind of fall. It didn't turn out last year like it was, not, it wasn't the videos or the pictures we'd seen. We're hoping this year's a little bit better. It didn't get seeded early enough again this year, because as soon as we did get all our post-emergence, spray on our corn, well, then we got that, we couldn't go in the field for 10 days, 2 weeks. It got real wet here. We got the 3 inches of rain.
Last year, so.
Yeah.
It got pretty tall, because when I was going, as you'll be able to see on the machine there, the corn was as tall as the toolbar.
Yeah, I sent you a video of that.
So that was, that's way too tall.
Yeah.
I mean, you can do it, yeah, but you're not going to get a lot of sunlight there to get to germinate. Not in all parts of the field were that way either, but where we came back and did some later when we filmed, interseeding and whatnot, where we went a couple days prior. It was surprising how fast that popped up when you had the sunlight on the rows.
With this, we had 4 or 5 days, whatever, in this, and you can start rolling the soybeans and stuff in between the corn rows. Whereas with the broadcast, without moisture, it's going to be pretty spotty and not come near as fast. Well, kind of like after you interseed or put the cover crop behind the drain, one day in the fall is like 5 days in the spring. It's just, those days are short. You almost need to be interseeding behind the combine what you combined yesterday. Just to get it done faster if you want to raise it and get something out of it. And them days are awfully important in the fall. Yeah.
And for wind erosion if you're not going to graze it.
Yeah.
Because Mother Nature does have a way of biting where you don't want it, so.
Yeah. I thought about some negative things about that mix after the fact, but,
I don't know if it'll grow enough to get to that point. I mean, if you got some more open areas in the field, you might get some individual plants, but I don't know if you'll get widespread.
And hopefully the purity of the seed, and hopefully the wild oats part of the seed is out of that particular strain of seed, so you're not going to be spreading that all over where we planted that. So there again, you're going back to how good is your seed that you're getting.
What are you going to plant next year on that field?
Soybeans.
Soybeans?
Yep. So we'd like to have just a clean furrow and come right in the spring and just no-till right into that same, with GPS, we'll be putting soybeans right in on top of that interseeded furrow. And it should be nice and warm. It should be, and there should be all kinds of productivity there. I mean, there should be, we're hoping that we don't have any something bad competition there. We're hoping that we've set up a scenario where it complements next year's soybean crop. The next field then we looked at on the way to town, we stopped by a field it was a wheat field last year that after wheat harvest, we seeded 39 pounds of rye, 24 pounds of peas, and 2 pounds of hairy vetch. And that grew right until freeze up, took off. It was the first thing green on the farm this spring, and we terminated that at about knee high, probably right around the 15th to 20th of May, and no-tilled in soybeans into that mix with our 12-row 22-inch planter.
You said that was the annual rye or the weird rye?
That was what they call winter rye.
Winter rye.
So anyway, we've been doing that mix for a while on all of our drain ground and stuff. We really, really like that mix. That makes just for fantastic soybeans the next year. They're clean, and that's another issue. We're going to be fighting water hemp, and we got a real bad ragweed problem and stuff west of town. That field, I don't think you'd starve to death. Find one ragweed plant out there. It's very clean, looks good. It's a sandy kind of a hot piece of ground. The beans are healthy as to be. That's just a real easy, good mix. You can use the county drill for a project like that. It's a good mix to plant. And
Did you roll that field, or did you plant it standing?
we rolled it. Yeah, we own our own roller, so we roll everything before we plant it. It just makes the planter just work better. It's firm. You can almost put an open cup of coffee on the planter unit. Then it just pushes little stones down. we want to give the planter the best path it can take, the smoothest, best,
Anytime that planter row is bouncing, or I know every time that's bouncing too much, that just means it's going to have
Yeah.
uneven seed bed on the ground.
And like I said, you only plant about 5 to 5.5 miles an hour anyway.
They always talk about speed planting these days, cover acres. Well, you got one chance to plant a plant to make it grow and get the best out of it. And I don't plant any faster than 5 miles an hour. I'd probably do more planting at 4.5, or maybe even sometimes put down close to 4.
Yeah.
And it just makes a better plant bed out of it. And, you're not skipping it. You're not making the plant do something it's not supposed to do.
One thing we never talked about, Will and I, we were in the past years we've rented out ground for sugar beets. And after they harvested the beets on our ground west of town, we went out there with a fertilizer spreader and spread our P&K for the following year with winter rye and chisel plowed it in. So it was the worst of the worst seed bed ever. So hardly any winter rye came in the fall, but it did green the field up. And people thought that was kind of funny, just a waste of time. But I said, I'm not worried about the sugar beet ground blowing in the fall. We're worried about the spring. Well, in the spring, that winter rye took off in the beet field, at 30 degrees. And we had to terminate that rye, at knee high also in that kind of ground also, where the other beet ground around the country was blowing just terribly. And that was incorporated with a chisel plow.
In November.
Yeah. They
It only got about that tall in the fall.
it didn't, just enough, and then it froze off. But boy, come spring, that's still, yeah. So then the third field we looked at is right east of us here. Last year's corn stalks that was interseeded and grazed. We did have to terminate the rye that came, the annual rye that came this spring in them furrows. That was rolled previous to planting. Cows had grazed it. Really nice looking seed bed, and the beans look real good there right now.
And what did you get into plant?
Well, that's fairly sandy. It was timely. That was 20th of May, whatever. Or whatever. There was no holds up on any of that ground that way. Yeah.
And actually, being that the cattle grazed it, we went in there with the roller, of course, and smashed down the corn stalks, but it's surprising how much the roller flattened out or busted up even cow pies that were out there.
Yeah.
You wouldn't think it would do much, but it did. It did enough to, because on this particular chunk of ground, we never fed out there. So you didn't have the concentration of feeding areas to deal with. So if they were just moseying across that particular chunk of ground to go forage or whatever for the day, there was just a cow pie here and there all over the place, not concentrated so bad. So I'm surprised how the roller really worked good for that.
What kind of roller?
Yeah, it's just a 45-foot wide drum roller. It's pretty standard to the industry, I guess. It really makes a nice seed bed. It levels things out nice, and it's growing up. You'd think you got to fluff that ground up before you plant it. Now we firm it up before we plant it. We're totally the opposite mindset. We got roots and stuff in the ground that are not touched. That already got the ground loose and vibrant that way. So now we use the roller to firm it before we plant it to make our planter do a better job. And yeah.
So do you guys want to talk about starting last fall, sort of your growing season? What's sort of typical? Talk about timing, when you're getting in, what you're putting in, when the cows go in, how long they're in.
Our planting season really starts in the fall. After small grain comes off, we raise malt barley for Anheuser-Busch. So after we harvest that, we'll come in with a cover crop mix. You name it, we've tried it. As far as getting into specifics, winter hairy vetch, Austrian winter peas, regular field peas, cereal rye is a big component of that. We'll do some oats in there as well, and then we always get some barley regrowth coming. We've done different clovers. Radish and turnips are cheap. They're a good base to start with. Kale has been a real good one lately for us. We've been pretty impressed with the growth on that. And then we'll try to get that as soon as we get done combining. last year it was August 32nd, I think it was, by the time we got it planted. So we cut out a lot of those things. If we're in early in August, like around that 10th of August or time frame, you can really give it everything you want, and it grows, and it seems like we can hit a home run. But when we start getting late, just that 2 weeks, it's huge for growth in the fall. But anyways, so we'll come in then and graze that in October, November time frame with our cows, and then from there we'll have a full season cover crop that we'll come into then usually around that December time frame. We'll move the cows off of those cover crops that were planted after small grains, go into the full season cover crop, and usually that gets us up to about Christmas. And then we also plant some standing corn for grazing in the winter, and then we'll transition into that once the calves are weaned in December. And then the last few years we made it till the end of January, first week of February on that grazing corn. And then we'll start our winter feeding program at that point. And then in the spring, when that cereal rye comes back up, so usually in the first week of May or so, we're able to get the cows onto that cereal rye regrowth and start grazing some of that. So we'll calve on that rye late. This year it was a little bit later when we got to it. It was about the 20th of May, I suppose. By the time we got out there, it wasn't ready, in case that we weren't ready for it. So we'll come in from that, and then once we're done with that, we usually graze cereal rye until about the 1st of June, and then we'll go into our cool season pastures. And then we'll no-till our barley or wheat into soybean stubble in the spring, and then most of our corn goes into either cover crops, cereal rye regrowth in the spring. We terminate either immediately before or immediately after planting, and then no-till a lot of beans into corn stalks then that spring, and some into wheat ground or barley ground that's got rye growing on it. The soybeans usually get planted into rye that's about knee-high. Depending on the year, 2 years ago it was waist-high and fully headed out May 35th or something like that when we were planting beans. We don't plant in June, so we just extend the month of May if we had to there a couple years ago. But this year everything was in by the 25th of May. Terminated that rye in those beans with glyphosate and Verdict, and those fields are still clean today. We haven't touched those yet. On our corn stubble that we no-tilled beans into, there again we'll come in and do a pre-plant burn down or post-plant burn down, but pre-emergent. Try and get some residual on there as well to help carry us through into the summer as long as we can. The cows then work their way through the cool season pastures first, and then we'll transition into some of the warm season pasture that we have now, and then we'll come off of that. That'll get us usually until that October, November time frame again, and then we'll come back in and start grazing cover crop again the next fall.
So let's talk a little bit about that waist-high rye. What was that like?
No big deal.
No big deal.
No big deal. You'd think some people think things got out of control or whatnot, but in fact the planter never ran so smooth. I mean, it was quiet, no dust, nothing, and then we come through there with the land roller and roll that after we plant, and just laid that rye right down on the ground, and it terminate with the glyphosate pass. But that provides us with weed protection pretty much for the full summer. The amount of the straw residue that we have there we run a stripper head on all our small grains, so we've got tall straw from that, and then between that and the combination of the rye, and we've got a lot of carbon laying on the soil, and that takes a while to break that down, but that really has provided us basically a herbicide pass for the summer. I mean, because nothing grows through it other than those beans that come up. So we've been pretty fortunate with that. That's been, and you part that straw and residue, I mean, the soil is really working underneath there. It just looks healthier, and the amount of earthworm activity is unbelievable in those no-till systems.
That was another question. What changes have you noticed in your soil with the changes that you have made?
The amount of earthworms is probably the easiest thing to see if you take a shovel and turn that over, and just that soil structure and the amount of roots that are in that ground now. The soil aggregation, you know, Michael called it cottage cheese looking soil, you know, and you hear that term a lot in this industry. And just that humus that's in there and the smell, there's life in that soil.
I noticed this year just seeding beans into corn stubble, you know, no-tilling beans in there. Just even going down as far as looking for the depth of your seed, I mean, how many earthworms you found, I mean, not just on this particular field, on every field that we did it. And it's like, wow, I've never ran into this before. I mean, yeah, there's moisture right there, of course that's what you want, but I was surprised at the amount of earthworms that you in any given spot. So, I mean, a lot more down there than you think there.
I noticed it right away when I was putting down fertilizer on all of the wheat and bean stubble for planting corn. You know, the soil is just more consistent. It's healthier. You know, I didn't go through any mud spots. I never slipped a wheel on the, you know, putting fertilizer down in. It's just areas where you knew holy man, I know I historically know this piece of ground could be a little tough, and it went pretty good. You know, the ground, changing the organic matter, changing the soil structure, changes the type of, you know, quality of the ground pretty fast. You know, we've took a lot of our ground and upgraded the quality of it and made it healthier. And you know, I don't know how you put that into dollars, you know, to measure it that way, but we know we're heading the right direction, you know, with what we're doing. So, and we're doing it with less machinery, less labor, and we're protecting ourselves against, you know, weather swings, you know, wet or dry weather swings.